In the spring of 1989, a bizarre fleet set sail from the naval bases of the Soviet Union. It was a formidable armada, 17 diesel attack submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. In terms of raw numbers, it was enough naval firepower to challenge many smaller nations. But this fleet wasn't sailing to war. It wasn't on a diplomatic mission. It wasn't even flying the naval ensign of the USSR. This fleet belonged to a corporate entity headquartered in Purchase, New York. For a very brief, surreal window in history, PepsiCo, the makers of sugary carbonated sugar water, possessed the 6th largest navy on the face of the earth. It sounds like a joke, a piece of Cold War trivia to chuckle about at a dinner party. But if you peel back the layers of this absurd transaction, you find something profoundly tragic. You find the autopsy report of a superpower. The story of how a soda company ended up commanding a fleet of Soviet warships is not a comedy. It is a story of supreme economic desperation. It is the story of a nuclear-armed empire that had so thoroughly destroyed its own financial system that it was forced to revert to the Bronze Age practice of barter just to keep its citizens pacified with a taste of Western luxury. To understand how we got to this point in 1989, we have to go back 30 years to the height of the Cold War and a sweltering summer day in Moscow in 1959. The occasion was the American National Exhibition. It was a cultural exchange program designed to thaw tensions between the US and the USSR. The Americans built a glittering pavilion in Sokolniki Park, filled with the wonders of capitalism, color televisions, modern kitchen appliances, dishwashers, and Cadillacs. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, wandered through the exhibit, getting increasingly annoyed. He saw it as a piece of capitalist propaganda designed to make the Soviet worker feel inferior. He got into a heated, impromptu argument with Vice President Richard Nixon, standing in the middle of a model American kitchen. This became famous as the kitchen debate. Khrushchev was sweating. He was angry. He was shouting about the superiority of communism. And standing nearby, watching this geopolitical theater, was a man named Donald Kendall. Kendall was the head of Pepsi's international division. He had staked his entire career on getting Pepsi into the Soviet Union. He knew that if he could just get the product into Khrushchev's hands, it would be the ultimate marketing coup. Kendall grabbed a paper cup and poured an ice-cold Pepsi. Against all protocol, he stepped between the Vice President of the United States and the Premier of the Soviet Union and handed the cup to Khrushchev. Khrushchev, hot and flustered, took a sip. He paused. The carbonation hit his tongue. The sugar rushed to his brain. A smile spread across the face of the dictator. He finished the cup and declared to the surrounding press, "It's very refreshing." The photo of the Soviet leader drinking the American icon went around the world. Donald Kendall had won his bet. But this was just a photo op. The real work took another 13 years of agonizing negotiations. The problem wasn't politics. The Soviets wanted the soda. They wanted to show their people that communism could provide the same nice things as capitalism. The problem was money. The Soviet currency, the ruble, was a soft currency. This meant it had absolutely no value outside of the Soviet Union. You couldn't take a suitcase of rubles to a bank in London or New York and exchange them for dollars or pounds. No international bank wanted them. The official exchange rate set by Moscow was a fiction. On the global market, the paper was worthless. Pepsi was a business. They needed to be paid in hard currency, dollars, so they could buy the syrup ingredients, pay their shareholders, and book a profit. The Soviets didn't have dollars to spare. They were at an impasse. The Soviets wanted the product but couldn't pay for it. Pepsi wanted the market but couldn't get the cash out. Finally, in 1972, they struck a deal that seemed brilliant at the time. It was a barter arrangement. Pepsi agreed to build bottling plants inside the USSR and provide the secret syrup concentrate. In exchange, the Soviet government gave Pepsi the exclusive rights to import and sell Stolichnaya vodka in the United States. It was a liquid-for-liquid swap, American sugar water for Russian potato spirit. For a while, it worked beautifully. Pepsi became the first Western consumer product to be widely sold behind the Iron Curtain. It was a sensation. For the average Soviet citizen, whose life was defined by gray drabness and shortages, that bright blue and red can was a tiny, fizzy taste of another world. It was liquid freedom. They loved it. By the mid-1980s, the Soviets were drinking 1 billion servings of Pepsi a year. But there was a flaw in the plan. The thirst of the Soviet people for Pepsi was growing much, much faster than the thirst of the American people for Stolichnaya vodka. There was a massive trade imbalance. Pepsi was shipping oceans of syrup to Russia, but they couldn't sell enough vodka in America to cover the costs. They were accumulating millions of worthless rubles inside the USSR, money that was trapped. By the late 1980s, the original contract was nearing its expiration date. Donald Kendall, now the CEO of PepsiCo, flew to Moscow to renegotiate. He found a country that was teetering on the edge of an abyss. The economic stagnation of the previous decades was coming to a head. The Soviet leadership was desperate to renew the contract. They knew that taking Pepsi away from the people now would cause riots. It was one of the few creature comforts left in a crumbling society. But when Kendall asked how they planned to bridge the massive financial gap, the Soviet officials just shrugged. They had no dollars. They had no more vodka to give. The negotiations dragged on, with the 1989 deadline looming. Kendall made it clear, no payment mechanism, no Pepsi. The syrup taps would be turned off. The Kremlin panicked. They needed to find something, anything that a Western corporation would accept as payment. They looked through their inventory as a nation. Their cupboards were bare of consumer goods. Their technology was outdated. But there was one thing the Soviet Union had in abundance. One thing they had spent the last 40 years building at the expense of everything else. They had weapons. Massive, terrifying amounts of military hardware. And so, in the austere meeting rooms of Moscow, a Soviet official slid a piece of paper across the table to the Pepsi executives. It wasn't a check. It was a list of warships. The Soviets were proposing the most insane business deal of the 20th century. They couldn't pay their soda tab with money, so they offered to pay with a navy. The moment the Soviet officials placed the inventory list on the table, the room fell silent. The Pepsi executives, men accustomed to dealing with aluminum can suppliers and corn syrup futures, stared at the paper in disbelief. They were looking at a manifest that belonged in the Pentagon, not a corporate boardroom in Westchester County. The list detailed a fleet of 17 diesel-electric attack submarines, Project 613 class, known to NATO as Whiskey class, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. It was a surreal proposition. The Soviet Union, the other half of the bipolar world order, the empire that had terrified the West with threats of burying them, was now offering to trade its own military hardware for a soft drink license. It was the ultimate geopolitical humiliation, disguised as a business transaction. Donald Kendall and his team didn't blink. They were businessmen. They didn't care about the prestige of the Soviet Navy. They cared about the bottom line. They quickly did the math. The ships were old. They were obsolete by 1989 standards, rusting in the cold waters of the Baltic and North Seas. They weren't going to be used to patrol the Atlantic for Pepsi. They were going to be sold for scrap metal. Pepsi accepted the deal. In doing so, they inadvertently created one of the strangest statistics in military history. For the few weeks it took to process the paperwork and transfer the titles to a Norwegian scrapyard, PepsiCo technically possessed the sixth largest submarine fleet in the world. They had more attack submarines than the navies of India, Australia, or the Netherlands. The logistics of the transfer were grimly poetic. The submarines, which had once prowled the oceans hunting for American aircraft carriers, were towed to a shipyard in Norway. There they were cut apart by torches. The steel hull of a Soviet Leviathan was melted down, recycled, and perhaps, in a twist of supreme irony, eventually turned into the very aluminum cans that would hold the Pepsi required to satisfy the Soviet thirst. But the warships were just the tip of the iceberg. The deal, valued at roughly $3 billion, was the largest commercial agreement ever signed between an American company and the Soviet Union. To make the numbers work, the Soviets didn't just empty their naval scrapyards, they mortgaged their future industrial capacity. Included in the deal was a promise to build 10 new massive oil tankers for Pepsi. The Soviet Union had plenty of shipyards, but no cash to run them. Pepsi agreed to take ownership of these tankers once they were built. They wouldn't use them to transport soda. They would lease them out on the international market to move oil, earning hard currency in dollars or Norwegian kroner, which they could then put on their own balance sheet. Pepsi had effectively become a middleman for the entire Soviet economy. They were acting as a merchant bank, a scrap metal dealer, a shipping magnate, and a vodka distributor, all just to sell a beverage that cost a few cents to produce. The news of the deal hit the American press in May 1989. It caused a sensation, but in Washington, D.C., it caused heartburn. The Bush administration was wary. They were in the middle of delicate arms control negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev. They felt upstaged. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft expressed his concern to Donald Kendall. He questioned the wisdom of an American corporation engaging in military disarmament treaties with a hostile power. Kendall, feeling the flush of victory, famously replied, "We are disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." It was a witty retort, but it masked a darker reality. The fact that the Soviet Union was willing to trade its own warships for soda was not a sign of a thaw in relations. It was a sign of a fire sale. A superpower does not sell its navy for sugar water unless it is desperate. The Soviet economy in 1989 was in freefall. The ruble was experiencing hyperinflation. The budget deficit was spiraling out of control due to the collapse of oil prices and the disastrous war in Afghanistan. The command economy had ceased to command anything. The supply chains were broken. In the streets of Moscow, the reality of this collapse was visible in the eyes of the people. They didn't care about the submarines. They cared that the grocery stores were empty. They stood in lines for 6 hours to buy a loaf of gray bread or a carton of milk. The only thing that seemed to be available, the only splash of color in the gray landscape, were the Pepsi kiosks. Pepsi had become more than a drink. It was a status symbol. It was a symbol of the West, of a world where things worked, where packages were bright and shiny, and where life was sweet. The Soviet government knew this. They knew that if the Pepsi ran out, the people might finally snap. The deal with Kendall wasn't just commerce, it was riot control. They were trading submarines for social stability. The deal of the century, as it was called in the business press, was signed with champagne toasts and smiles. Pepsi expected to double its bottling plants in the USSR. They projected billions in future revenue. They thought they had secured a monopoly on the largest untapped consumer market in the world for the next century. But business deals rely on stability. They rely on the assumption that the government signing the contract today will still be the government in charge tomorrow. Donald Kendall and the Pepsi executives looked at the maps on the wall of the Kremlin and assumed those borders were permanent. They assumed the USSR was a fixed entity. They were wrong. While the ink was drying on the contracts in 1989, the tectonic plates of history were shifting beneath their feet. The Berlin Wall was just months away from falling. The satellite states of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, were beginning to break away from Moscow's orbit. The Soviet Union wasn't just broke, it was disintegrating. The deal that Pepsi had structured was based on a centralized Soviet state that could command resources from Ukraine, build ships in Russia, and distribute soda in the Baltics. But that centralized state was evaporating. Pepsi had bought a fleet, but they had bought it from a ghost. They had staked their financial future on a partner that was about to commit suicide. The ships were real, the steel was real, but the country that promised to pay the rest of the bill was about to vanish from the face of the earth. The euphoria of the Pepsi Navy moment blinded everyone to the chaos that was coming. No one in Purchase, New York, had a contingency plan for what to do if the Soviet Union simply stopped existing. They were about to learn that in the chaos of a collapsing empire, a contract is just a piece of paper, and a business deal can turn into a geopolitical nightmare overnight. The fleet had sailed, but it was sailing into a hurricane, and when the storm broke, Pepsi would find itself not as the owner of a lucrative monopoly, but as a creditor to a black hole. The greatest barter deal in history was about to collide with the greatest geopolitical collapse of the 20th century. The euphoria of the 1989 deal lasted exactly 2 years. In August 1991, the hardliners in the Communist Party launched a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. Tanks rolled into Red Square. The coup failed, but the authority of the central government evaporated. On December 25, 1991, the red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. For the world, this was a moment of liberation. For Donald Kendall and the executives at PepsiCo, it was a legal and logistical nightmare of biblical proportions. They woke up the next morning to realize that the deal of the century was worthless. The contract they had signed was with the Ministry of Trade of the USSR, but there was no Ministry of Trade anymore. There was no USSR. Instead, there were 15 squabbling independent nations, many of whom hated each other. Pepsi's empire was suddenly stranded across borders that hadn't existed yesterday. Their plastic bottles were manufactured in Belarus. Their glass bottles came from Lithuania. Their mozzarella cheese for the new Pizza Hut franchises came from Lithuania as well. The shipyards building their oil tankers were in Ukraine, and the headquarters was in Russia. Under the Soviet system, this was all one seamless internal market. Moscow gave an order, and the goods moved. But now, the Lithuanian border guards wanted customs duties for the glass. The Belarusians demanded payment in hard currency for the plastic. The Ukrainians seized the shipyards and declared that everything inside them, including the ships promised to Pepsi, was now the sovereign property of the new Ukrainian state. The Pepsi fleet, which had made headlines around the world, became the Phantom Fleet. The 10 massive oil tankers, which were supposed to be the financial anchor of the entire $3 billion deal, were held hostage in the Black Sea. The Ukrainian government looked at the contract signed by Moscow and essentially said, "This isn't our signature." They wanted a new deal. They wanted cash. PepsiCo found itself in the middle of a geopolitical divorce settlement. They were scrambling. Executives had to fly from Kiev to Minsk to Vilnius, trying to piece together a supply chain that had shattered into 1,000 pieces. They were no longer dealing with gray bureaucrats in suits. They were dealing with warlords, nationalists, and newly minted businessmen who carried guns in their waistbands. The chaos extended to the streets. The Russian economy in 1992 and 1993 underwent shock therapy. Price controls were lifted. Hyperinflation exploded. The ruble, which Pepsi had accumulated by the truckload, became less valuable than toilet paper. In the 1980s, a bottle of Pepsi cost 45 kopecks. By 1993, it cost thousands of rubles. But the price didn't matter because the money was meaningless. Pepsi couldn't convert their profits into anything usable. They were generating massive sales in local currency. But in terms of the dollar, the only metric that mattered to Wall Street, they were bleeding. And then there was the vodka problem. The original deal relied on Pepsi having the exclusive rights to sell Stolichnaya vodka in America. But with the collapse of the central state, the vodka distilleries were privatized, or rather they were stolen. The Stolichnaya brand, once the crown jewel of Soviet exports, became a free-for-all. Factories across Russia started pumping out cheap, low-quality spirit and slapping the Stoli label on it. The market was flooded with counterfeits. Pepsi was trying to sell a premium product in America, but back in Russia, gangsters were selling knockoff versions for pennies. The legal battles over who actually owned the trademark paralyzed the flow of vodka to the West. The barter loop was broken. No ships, no vodka revenue. Just billions of worthless rubles and a crumbling infrastructure. But the most surreal aspect of this collapse was played out in a restaurant. As part of the expansion, PepsiCo had opened the first Pizza Hut in Moscow. It was a sensation. People lined up for hours. But keeping it open required a logistical miracle. Because the Soviet agricultural system had collapsed, PepsiCo couldn't find decent ingredients. The local flour was too gritty, the local meat was gray. And the cheese? The Soviet Union didn't make mozzarella. To keep the pizzas authentic, Pepsi had to construct a global supply chain that resembled a military operation. They imported flour from France. They imported tomato sauce from Italy. They established a dedicated trade route just to bring cheese from Lithuania to Moscow, navigating through checkpoints where bribes were the only toll accepted. For a brief moment, Pizza Hut was one of the few functioning institutions in Russia. It was an island of stability where you could get a hot meal, provided you could pay in hard currency or barter. It became a hub for the new elite, the new Russians, who were getting rich by looting the state assets. It was here in the booths of a Pizza Hut, amidst the smell of imported pepperoni and the sound of fizzy Pepsi, that the new reality of Russia was being formed. It wasn't the democratic capitalist utopia the West had hoped for. It was a kleptocracy. The managers of the state-owned factories that bottled Pepsi realized that there was no one watching the store. The central planners were gone, so they effectively stole the factories. They privatized them into their own hands. PepsiCo had to renegotiate contracts, not with a government minister, but with the guy who used to be the plant manager and now acted like a feudal lord. These new owners didn't care about long-term contracts or international law. They wanted cash, upfront, in briefcases. The dream of the deal of the century was dying a death of 1,000 cuts. The submarines had been scrapped, their metal sold for a pittance that barely covered the cost of towing them. The tankers were locked in legal limbo. The vodka was compromised. By the mid-1990s, the unique advantage Pepsi had enjoyed, the monopoly, was gone. Coca-Cola had arrived. While Pepsi was bogged down trying to fix its broken barter deals and salvage its fleet, Coca-Cola swept in with hard cash. They didn't have the baggage of the Soviet era. They built new factories from scratch. They flooded the airwaves with advertising. They painted the gray streets of Moscow red. The Russian people, eager to shed the skin of their Soviet past, began to see Pepsi as the old drink. It was the drink of the Brezhnev era, the drink of stagnation. Coca-Cola was the drink of the new, wild, dangerous freedom. In just a few years, Pepsi's decades-long lead evaporated. They had traded warships and navigated the corridors of the Kremlin, but they were being beaten by a simple marketing campaign and a supply of actual dollars. The Pepsi fleet, once a symbol of innovative corporate diplomacy, had become an albatross. It was a reminder of a world that no longer existed. The company was stuck holding the bag for a bankrupt empire. But the final twist of the knife came from the geopolitical chaos itself. As Russia descended into the first Chechen War and economic ruin, the assets that Pepsi thought they had secured, the physical ships, became pawns in a much larger game. The Ukrainian government, desperate for cash and asserting its independence from Russia, finally made a move on the tankers that Pepsi was waiting for. They didn't just hold them hostage, they sold them. The ships that were supposed to pay for a generation of soda were sold off to other buyers or absorbed into national shipping lines. Pepsi was left standing on the dock, holding a contract signed by a dead man from a dead country. The barter economy had failed. The transition to capitalism wasn't a handshake, it was a mugging. And PepsiCo was learning the hard way that in the ruins of a superpower, possession is 10/10 of the law. By the late 1990s, the Pepsi Navy had largely vanished. The submarines were razor blades, the cruiser and the destroyer were rusted scrap. The oil tankers were sailing under different flags, generating revenue for Ukrainian oligarchs, not American shareholders. The great fleet that had once been the sixth largest in the world existed only in corporate legends and accounting write-offs. But while the physical ships were gone, the legacy of the deal lingered as a cautionary tale. PepsiCo eventually stabilized its position in Russia, but the dream of total dominance was over. They had to fight for every inch of market share against Coca-Cola, playing by normal rules in a market that was anything but normal. The ultimate symbol of this new era came in 1997 in a commercial that is perhaps the strangest piece of footage ever filmed. It featured Mikhail Gorbachev himself, the man who had ruled the Soviet Union, the man who had commanded the armies that the Pepsi fleet was built to support, was now a private citizen. He needed money. His pension from the Russian state was worthless due to hyperinflation. So he agreed to star in a Pizza Hut commercial. The ad shows Gorbachev walking into a Pizza Hut in Moscow with his granddaughter. A family at a nearby table notices him. They start arguing. Because of him, we have economic confusion, the father shouts. Because of him, we have opportunity, the son replies. Because of him, we have political instability. Because of him, we have freedom. The argument escalates until the grandmother intervenes. She points to the pizza. Because of him, we have many things, like Pizza Hut. The family stops. They agree. They raise their slices of pizza and shout, "Hail to Gorbachev!" It is a surreal, almost heartbreaking scene. The leader of a superpower, reduced to a pitchman for fast food, selling his legacy for a slice of pepperoni. It perfectly encapsulated the victory of consumer capitalism over Soviet ideology. The warships didn't matter. The nuclear missiles didn't matter. In the end, the only thing that mattered was the pizza. But looking back, the Pepsi fleet story tells us something profound about the nature of money and value. The Soviet Union collapsed because it forgot what money was. It tried to run a complex modern economy by command, ignoring the signals of price and demand. When that failed, it reverted to the primitive barter of ships for syrup. PepsiCo, on the other hand, understood money too well. They saw value where others saw junk. They were willing to engage in financial acrobatics that would make a modern hedge fund manager dizzy. But even they were defeated by the chaos of state collapse. They learned that a contract requires a government to enforce it. Without a state, there's no market, only looting. Today, the story of the Pepsi Navy is often told as a funny anecdote. Remember when a soda company had submarines? But it is really a story about the fragility of power. The Soviet submarines were built to destroy the West. They were the ultimate expression of Soviet industrial might. And yet, they ended their lives being traded for sugar water, scrapped to pay for a fleeting taste of the enemy's lifestyle. It turns out that the most powerful weapon in the Cold War wasn't the ICBM or the T-72 tank. It was the blue jean, the rock and roll record, and the can of soda. The Soviet people didn't revolt because they wanted democracy in the abstract. They revolted because they wanted a normal life. They wanted what the rest of the world had. Pepsi didn't defeat the Soviet Union. But the desperate need for Pepsi, and everything it represented, revealed the hollowness of the Soviet system. The fleet was the price the USSR paid for its failure. As we look at the world today, where sanctions and trade wars are again the tools of geopolitics, the Pepsi story is a reminder. Economies are not just numbers on a screen. They are living, breathing things made of human desires. And when a government can no longer satisfy those desires, no amount of warships can save it. The submarines are gone. The Soviet Union is gone. But somewhere in Russia, a teenager is opening a can of soda. And in that simple act, you can hear the echo of the empire that sold its sword to buy a drink. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.